Geek Therapy Radio.
Welcome to the Geek Therapy Radio podcast. You've got your mental curator, Johnny Hemberger. I'm doing things kind of a little bit different today. I'm doing a lot of things weird with this particular podcast. One, you're seeing it. You're seeing it here on YouTube. I've got it underneath my podcasts playlist, so there's no confusion about what type of video this is. This is a completely unscripted podcast. I'm going to go over a few topics, but it's completely unscripted. It's not as polished as a video, say, about the AirPods Maxes or about the M1 Apple MacBook Pro that I'm using right now. It's just an off-the-cuff podcast. So if you're watching on YouTube, that's what's going on. Also, if you're watching on YouTube, it boggles the mind that Apple still doesn't include high-quality webcams in their MacBooks. The MacBook Air, but especially the MacBook Pro. Why this isn't, 1080p with HDR and just a super crisp, like throwing an iPhone 4 camera into here, Apple. My goodness gracious, this 720p disaster. And you say you have all this extra kind of visual aids kind of logic going on to improve the signal of the webcam to make it look better. I know I'm not in the ideal lighting conditions, but does this look good to you? I mean, disregard this face, but does this image quality look good to you? I know I'm in a little thumbnail down in the corner, but still, you get my point. 720p craptastic potato webcam and a MacBook Pro in the year 2020. Ridiculous. I didn't mean to get so sidetracked, but welcome to Geek Therapy Radio. The second silly thing that I'm doing here with this podcast is if you listen to the audio-only version, that is, if you go to your favorite podcast app and type in Geek Therapy Radio Podcast, look for the red, white, and black color scheme, and you subscribe to the podcast. If you're listening to it just with your ears right now through a podcast app, you are actually listening to a normal bias cassette tape. I have run this show through a normal bias cassette tape on my newly fixed. It's not completely fixed. I've got a Sony cassette deck, a 3-head cassette deck. And it sounds amazing. I mean, obviously, but if you're just watching the YouTube video, you're not hearing the cassette audio. But if you're listening to the podcast audio only version, yes, surprise, surprise, you are listening to a normal bias cassette tape in the year 2020. It's digitized for the podcast, but you get what I'm saying. Anyways, I like to tinker with things like that here on Geek Therapy Radio. Okay, on to the meat and potatoes, as I am one to say here on Geek Therapy Radio. I saw this headline, this Atari VCS headline come across the wire. I'm in a radio station, the wire, from Engadget.com. And I had to do a double take, and I had to check the date of the article, and it says 8 hours ago. I had to check the date of the article because we've been hearing about the Atari VCS for years. Actually, I think I started Geek Therapy Radio and I was talking about the Atari VCS, and we thought it was just going to be vaporware. It was never coming out. It just kept getting pushed back and pushed back. And then when the pandemic happened, I was like, you know what? I just don't think the Atari VCS is ever going to happen. It's going to be vaporware. Apparently, though, according to this article, I think somewhere towards the end, this is not specifically what I wanted to talk about, but apparently early backers of the Atari VCS have started to, here we go. The Atari VCS is currently shipping out to early backers after significant delays. Significant delays, yeah. But I'm surprised by this statement right here. The Atari VCS is currently shipping out to early backers. I have no confirmation of this. Granted, I have not gone to Twitter or around there to see any actual photos or videos of people playing their Atari VCSs, but it's flabbergasting to me if it's true that people are actually getting their VCSs. Me and a significant chunk of the tech community had already dismissed the Atari VCS as, like I said, vaporware. Through maybe no fault of their own, I was excited about it at the beginning. I thought it was a really cool idea. But then the more time went on, the more I kind of just got this feeling like it's ill-fated, to say the least. But I want to talk about the Atari VCS because it's kind of changed and morphed over its development. And basically, I will defend this argument as we go along, but basically my thoughts on it now are it's just a PC. It's a Ryzen-powered PC in an Atari-styled case, basically. That's my argument here. And the first credence to this argument here is that it costs $390 from Atari. But let's move over to Atari's own website, the Atari VCS website, to further go down this rabbit hole. $390. That's with a $10 discount off the MSRP. And you get free shipping. So let's call it about $400 for the Atari VCS. You could build a PC for $400, I would argue, as powerful as the Atari VCS when you're using AMD Ryzen APU with the built-in graphics. I think a motorcycle just went by. When you're using an AMD chip with built-in Radeon graphics, which is what the Atari VCS is using, I submit that this is it's a PC. I mean, at the end of the day, with all the revisions, and I kind of hate that it happened this way, because I wanted the Atari VCS 800, is what they're calling it, to be its own standalone console. And yes, there will be, first party, what do you call it? Exclusive titles for it. I don't know what those are off the top of my head, but I would imagine there's going to be exclusive titles for the Atari VCS. But still, does a few exclusive Atari titles warrant an entire console? And it could not come out at a worse timing. PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X, and it's at a similar sort of price point to those. $400 is a very similar price point to those. But I want to wrap back around to the ill-fatedness of this and how this is really just a PC in my mind. So we'll go along these little blurbs here. Play, discover new classic games on Atari's new open platform powered by AMD Ryzen with Radeon graphics technology. Okay, so a PC. Stream, watch your favorite web-based streaming videos and entertainment and play games at up to 4K resolutions and 60 frames per second. Okay, that's a PC. Also a console, like a PS5 or Xbox Series X. Create, develop new TV-based games and apps yourself, your family, or to share with the Atari VCS community. That's neat, but game development, I don't mean to sound like a douche here, but if there was only some sort of platform where developers could create games, some sort of personal computing type device where people create games that they send to their friends and family and communities. So, all right, Connect. I'm sorry, I'm being catty here. Connect. Atari's first connected device opens new possibilities to play with friends and publish your creations as part of an expansive community of gamers, fans, and devs. Let me make sure I'm recording on VCS, because that would suck if I wasn't recording with VCS. All right. This connection, again, PC, all this stuff. Atari's first connected device opens possibilities, play with friends, and publish creations as part of expansive community games. So that's just like create, fans and devs. PC. You do that on PC all the time. So, built for today, using USB 3.0, just like a PC, HDMI, just like a PC, Wi-Fi, just like a PC, Ethernet, just like a PC, Bluetooth connectivity, just like a PC, and the all-new Atari VCS delivers unprecedented levels of flexibility and control, like a PC, transforming how we interact with our TVs, just as the original 2600 did a few decades ago. Well, not really, because HTPCs exist. I've had a computer hooked up to my TV for years. That is okay. 4K HDR video streaming like a TV and like a PC. So the Atari Vault, this moves on to the actual gaming of it all. Sorry about that. So the Atari VCS comes with more than 100 home and arcade classics, according to Atari here. So old, 2600, I would imagine 50, was it the 5200, 7800? The different Atari consoles, I would imagine, have games represented, built in here to the Atari VCS. And that's cool, but I have a feeling that, oh gosh, it's hard to say this, to kind of put this into words that make sense. It's speaking no good too hard to speak. Emulators. A lot of people who know about the Atari VCS, and I feel that would be excited about the Atari VCS or who have been following the Atari VCS will be well versed in emulation. And since I've got OBS running here, I can open up OpenEMU and kind of show you what I'm talking about. I think, where are my 2600 games? Maybe I don't have 2600 games. Anyways, this is where they would go if I did. That's the OpenEMU emulator. I got to check on that. I thought I copied my legally obtained ROMs there. But since I'm making this kind of case that the Atari VCS 800 is pretty much just a PC, that the bundled Atari games, they are appealing, and I know it's because it's 100% legal, obviously. But I think there's also people that own cartridges of the Atari games and will be able to play Atari games on their emulators on any device, not just their personal PC. I'm just saying that the fact that the Atari VCS includes Atari games isn't really a huge differentiator from the pack, from being a PC. And lo and behold, let's go down a little bit further here across the webpage. Atari World is the Linux-based OS that comes on the Atari VCS. And if we avert our eyes over here, Atari PC mode, install any OS. And right there you can see that they've got a Windows 10 installation shown in their own thumbnail. So what is this thing? It's a $400 PC. Let's just call it what it is. The Atari VCS is a $400 PC in a custom case. Like a custom small form factor case. I think it looks cool. Don't get me wrong. If I had infinite money and I could just spend money willy-nilly, not even thinking about it, I would buy the Atari VCS. I know that I'm being really kind of harsh and catty, maybe, if you will, about the Atari VCS. But I would buy it if I had infinite amount of money. Now, I don't have an infinite amount of money. I have a very finite amount of money. So I don't think I will be purchasing with my own money an Atari VCS anytime soon because I already have many, many PCs that can do the exact same thing. The Atari VCS has an AMD Ryzen processor with Radeon graphics inside. Is it a 4000 series? Maybe we can check on that. Wi-Fi and Bluetooth enabled like a PC, compatible with most PC peripherals like a PC, customizable experience like a PC, Atari speaker hat compatible. I gotta forgive me. I don't know what the Atari speaker hat is off the top of my head. You can choose 3 different kind of variants of the Atari VCS, and by that I just mean cosmetic, like the faceplate looks different. The one I would have would be the black walnut, just like the original Atari console from the 1980s. Because that's what I had, an Atari 2600 growing up in the 80s. I lived in the 80s for 7 years. I was born in 1983, but the very first console I do remember as a wee lad, maybe 3, 4, 5 years old, was an Atari 2600, and I was bummed that my parents gave it to Little Brian down the street. His name was Little Brian. He was going off to college, but there was another kid on the street named Brian called Big Brian. Big Brian and Little Brian. Little Brian got the Atari 2600 when he went off to college. My parents were like, you guys already have your Nintendo. You don't need 2 video game systems. Who in this world would have 2 video game systems just lying around? That was inconceivable in the 80s, I guess. So that's really all I wanted to say about the Atari VCS. I'm going to open up a new tab here and Google what exact processor, because we're geeks and I want to know what the exact processor in the Atari VCS is. I want to say it was a 4000 series VCS processor, because I used to follow it quite closely. Why can't I get... Can I even Google processor? I used to follow this kind of daily a couple years ago. So the Atari VCS apparently features an AMD Ryzen embedded R160-1606G Zen processor with onboard Vega 3. Let's see here. I thought it was a CPU. Okay, according to Wikipedia here, it's the 14 nanometer Ryzen processor based on Ryzen 3 2200. 2200! What are we at now? What's the processors, the processors in mobile devices right now? 4000 series, 7 nanometer process, 2 cores, 4 threads on the 2200U. Jiminy Christmas. 8 gigabytes of DDR4 upgradable, like a PC. I think the base models come with 4 gigabytes of DDR4, all upgradable, like a PC. And I won't go into all the other kind of specs here. I mean, it's PC specs. It's a PC in an Atari case. That's the perfect way to sum it all up. Now, I don't want to go off on that rant, what I just did, being extremely critical of it, without thinking of the developers and the engineers and Atari in general. Atari is a European, I think it's a French company now. I think it's run in France, if I'm not mistaken. I'm sorry, I'm looking away from the camera here. Atari has had some struggles since the 80s. It is up until this point, up until the Atari VCS, it's been mostly a software company. What I think Roller Coaster Tycoon and those types of games were Atari, if I'm not mistaken. Atari still made software titles. So it was strange when Atari announced that they were going to release a new console. But the problem here is I just don't think it's different enough of a console, because you can't install, not easily, I mean, not with some wizardry, I haven't even heard of this happening yet, install Windows 10 on a PlayStation 5 or install Windows 10 on an Xbox Series X. It's not so, those consoles obviously are not so open source like that. The Atari VCS, it seems so completely just open source. And you can install Linux on it, you can install, I'm sure maybe someone will do some form of Hackintosh on it, install Windows on it, install different flavors of like I said, Linux and Ubuntu and all that stuff. So I think it's really cool. I just don't know what Atari was thinking with it. I don't think there's too much different about it other than just the way it looks, because anybody looking underneath the skin just sees that it's a PC, and it's so much of a PC that Atari, in their own language, in their own press releases, in their own webpage, says, yeah, go install Windows 10 on it. So it's cool, and I guess here's the sell. I guess here's kind of the sell for me and for somebody who is interested in such a thing. Do you want an HTPC that looks like an Atari? I think that's the sell. And at that point, it's kind of, it's really subjective. It's really niche. Sure, I would love an HTPC underneath my TV that looks like an Atari, so that people who don't have any clue of what it is, who are kind of older, oh, is that an old Atari under there? Remember Atari? No, it's an Atari VCS. It's an updated thing. But the person who wants to build an HTPC, I would feel that they could build a better HTPC for $400. I feel like that's the case. Even with AMD APUs, I think you darn sure get better than Ryzen 2200 CPU in the 14 nanometer with Ryzen 3 graphics. You know what? Let's see what the cheapest. Let's go to microcenter.com. I think Micro Center the website's been struggling, at least on my end, fairly recently. But I want to look at the processors and see where they're at, and see if you can theoretically make this argument that you could build a better Ryzen-based HTPC for $400. Micro Center doesn't have too terribly many Ryzen APUs. Not at the time of recording right now. They don't have any of them at the Houston-based Micro Center. Let's change the store to web. Can I do that over here? Shippable items. 3600. Oh, 3400G. Here we go. Okay. So a 3200G, it's $100. 3200G, that has built-in AMD graphics. Let's go with that one, since the VCS is based on the 2200U, and it's a variant of that, apparently. I want to see what the specs are on the 3200G. And again, Micro Center's been having problems, man. So off to the Google while Micro Center figures itself out. 3200G processor specs, and let's just look at the specs here for it. Just type in specs. Sorry for bearing with me here. Vega 8 graphics. So the graphics are already better on the $100 Ryzen 3200G. And I would bet dollars to donuts that you could build an HTPC around that for the rest of the $300. Because remember, you don't have to buy a graphics card. It's built into the 3200G. And it would be perform better than the VCS. I don't know what I'm clicking around on here for. So anyways, to start wrapping up this argument, to really wrap this up, because I do want to move on to another topic or two here in the podcast. I just don't understand the market, the consumer who is going to buy the VCS, who's going to look at a $400 Atari VCS and then a PlayStation 5 and an Xbox Series X for similar prices. They're a little more, around there, with similar price. If it were me and I saw Atari VCS, PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X, I would buy the Series X or the PS5, even though it was a little bit more expensive than the Atari VCS. But is that just me? I want to know what you think. So let me know what you think about the Atari VCS in the comments below. Sorry, I'm running the radio station at the exact same time as I'm doing this here. Let me know what you think about the Atari VCS in the comments below. Will you be picking up the Atari VCS? So an Engadget, when this last paragraph says that the Atari VCS is currently shipping out to early backers, I have a feeling that that might be, unfortunately, the only people who bought it, they bought it so early on, they backed it so early on before fully, golly, I apologize. They backed it so early on before knowing fully what this was that it's I already gave them my money and it's already promised to me, so I might as well get it. Here's a good question. If you are an early backer of the Atari VCS and you've received yours, would you have still bought it in its final incarnation? If you knew that this is what it was going to be, would you still have backed it early to receive it? Or would you say that's an HTPC, that is a PC with an AMD Ryzen processor in it that you can literally install Windows on? It's not enough differentiator. That the fact that it comes in an Atari kind of case is not a good enough kind of selling point to me. So if you bought one early and you backed it early, would you still buy it knowing what it is right now? It's one of those things that I think is cool. I think the Atari VCS is cool. I just can't. I couldn't personally justify it. If I had infinite money, I'd buy it, but I don't. So it's just going to be something neat, a cool looking PC that I just won't be picking up myself. Okay, so maybe this is the last subject we'll get to here on the podcast today. I want to talk about not necessarily the Audi R8 V10 itself, but I'm looking at an Ars Technica article, and it's a very poignant headline. And I've talked about this on Geek Therapy Radio, this kind of sentiment before on Geek Therapy Radio, that naturally aspirated engines, the ones that aren't forced induced, so not supercharged, not turbocharged, not whatever, naturally aspirated engines are becoming more and more rare, especially high displacement engines like the R8 V10 has a 5.2 liter V8 inside of it. No turbos, no nothing. It gets 16 miles per gallon combined. It's somewhere down here in the specs there. So it doesn't matter. Supercars don't get the best gas mileage. So this headline is true from Ars Technica. The Audi R8 V10 Performance, they won't make them like this much longer. And that's true. Now, the reason I wanted to talk about this subject here, they're not making them like this any longer. First of all, let's get some specs out of the way. $196,000 thereabouts. 5.2 liter V10. Red lines at 8,100 RPM, 602 horsepower, 413 foot-pounds of torque. That happens at 6,700 RPM. For the torque to come on that high is kind of neat. So those are basically the specs. 0 to 60, and I think it was 3.2 seconds, 3.5 seconds, thereabouts, paddle shifters. My only complaint, if we're going to talk about the Audi R8 V10 for a moment, the 2021 R8 V10, is that I can't... This part, the pictures here show it with the flappy paddles, with the automatic transmission, which I know is going to be faster, obviously, than a manual transmission, but I hope that this model comes with a manual transmission. If they're not going to make them like this much longer, quote unquote, I hope that they would include a manual transmission with it. Actually, I'm going to off to the Google here. 2021 Audi R8 manual. Let's see if that comes up. Do we offer in manual? All right, so I can't see anywhere that mentions that it has a manual transmission or that manual transmission is an option. Honestly, I'd be surprised in this day and age, this far into the 21st century, if even a naturally aspirated supercar would have a manual transmission. It just doesn't surprise me that there's no whisper that it does or doesn't. Not one that I could find immediately, however. So I wish it would come with a manual transmission, just a standard 6-speed transmission, even though I know it would shave a few milliseconds off of the 0 to 60 time, and it's entirely based on the driver, how good they are at shifting. It's just... the purist in me, if the engine's pure, naturally aspirated like that, they're not going to make many of these, anymore. Rather have it also come with a manual transmission. All of that is besides the point I want to make here. Inevitably, especially in Ars Technica, and I would imagine on most websites and magazines, digital magazines. Why did I even say that? With a comment section underneath an article about a naturally aspirated ICE car, internal combustion engine, you are going to undoubtedly have comments about, angry comments about how they're still producing cars that pollute so much, that only get 16 miles to the gallon, and everything should be electric now, and it's just horrible that they're even producing cars like this, right? Anymore. So my point here is, and you can see me kind of scrolling down because where did my comment go? I just had it. I basically left a comment. There was a comment that somebody left that said basically he was commenting the title, the Audi R8 V10 Performance. They won't make them like this much longer. To which he replied bluntly, quote, good. Bluntly, it's good that they won't make them like this much longer, this commenter says. To which my reply was, bluntly, horrible. And my argument here, and you can read it here if you're watching on the YouTube channel, but my argument basically was, every time that these, I call them greenie weenies, and I mean that with the most love in my heart that I can possibly muster, because they are people that genuinely care about the environment. I just think that sometimes we get that passion gets so blinded that it does not become objective anymore. And my argument is this person arguing, making the point that bluntly it's terrible that they're still making naturally aspirated ICE engines. And he goes on to say, and people argue they all should be electric now or hybrid now, or it's terrible that we're still burning fossil fuels. My argument is that, let's take a visual here. A busy freeway in Houston, or I was going to say Dubai. Do Dubai freeways get very busy? New York City, Los Angeles. Just picture a 5-lane wide freeway, 10-lane wide freeway, 5 on both sides, thousands of cars as far as the eye can see, just flowing down this freeway for hours, thousands and thousands of commuter cars. Every once in a while, after 100,000 cars have passed by, you might see an Audi R8 or a Lamborghini or a Ferrari. You will see hundreds of thousands of cars, of commuters, of Priuses that are burning oil, of Toyota Camrys that are burning oil, of Honda Civics burning oil, all these cars burning oil. A small fraction of those will be electric cars. It will be my Chevy Bolt, cruising along silently, electrically. But by and large, the lion's share, the vast majority of cars you will ever see commuting daily, being driven daily, are just normal commuter cars. That every once in a while, every blue moon, ever so rarely will you see a supercar. So my point is, it's not that the issue isn't that supercars still burn gas. It's that commuters still burn gas. And the quicker we can get to, electrifying or hybridizing or just reducing how much fuel that commuters consume, that's the real goal towards combating climate change. That it's totally okay and it's still really cool that cars like an Audi R8 V10 are still being produced, because they won't ever put even a drop of a bucket into climate change. They're driven so rarely, they exist so rarely out in the ecosystem that they cannot possibly put a dent or any measurable effect on greenhouse gas emissions that affect climate change. That they aren't the problem. The ultra rare supercar isn't the problem. It is the ultra ubiquitous commuter car that is the problem. And that's the focus. That's where you want to focus on really reducing emissions. That's where you want to focus on going to electric and whatever, powered by renewable energy. That when you come out of the woodwork as an environmentalist and attack a one-off supercar, a very rare supercar, it's missing the mark. It kind of doesn't deserve that kind of ecological bullying, so to speak. Let's just kind of pick our battles here. Battling against super rare hypercars and supercars burning oil is not a battle to pick. It's not a battle to wage. It's a fool's errand. It doesn't matter. What matters are commuters. What matters are the other 100,000 cars around that one supercar. The 100,000 cars burning oil are what is causing the problem, not the one supercar. And that's my whole point with that. And I know I've mentioned this on Geek Therapy Radio before, but I just wanted to end it mentioning that. I don't know why I get so butthurt about this. I get butthurt when things aren't, when we can't see the forest for the trees, when we get so passionate about things that we just can't sit back and be objective, and just kind of cool it a little bit, cooler jets, and just take things case by case. That kind of bugs me. Now, that being said, do I want this commenter or an environmentalist to stop their fight, to basically abandon, based on this argument that, hey, I won't go after supercars, that means my concern with the environment is, I guess it's not worth. No, obviously that's not what I'm saying. That's stupid. Keep the fight. Keep the environmentalist fight going. Be concerned about the environment. Be concerned about the earth. But pick your freaking battles. Supercars are cool. They are allowed to be cool because they're so rare. If there is one supercar, I promise you I'll end it on this. If there's one supercar tearing around, bobbing and weaving through 100,000 cars, I mean, they're driving like an idiot, but that one car getting, 12 miles to the gallon, that's fine. Because you know what? If the 100,000 cars around it are getting infinite miles per gallon, or not infinite, but you get what I'm saying. They're all getting the electric equivalent of like 150 miles a gallon or whatever it is. If you've reduced the millions of barrels of oil that these cars are consuming, that the commuter cars are consuming, the little fraction of a barrel of oil that supercar, that the owner is going to put through that supercar in the year, doesn't matter, versus the millions that the commuters will consume. So let's just kind of pick our battles here. Again, if you're watching this on YouTube, let me know what you think about that argument. I think that's going to wrap it up for today, actually. I don't know what else to say here. Just a reminder again, if you're listening to the audio-only podcast through your favorite podcast app, you're listening to you're listening to a normal bias cassette tape. Just a normal old cassette tape. It's probably a cassette tape that I found in a drawer that's been around since the 90s, and I'm probably recording over some Bob Dylan or something like that. But if you're listening to the podcast only, it is coming off of a cassette tape. I worked on my Sony cassette player. I'll let you know that I have this idea for a video where I just kind of want to explore the frequency response capabilities of cassette tape. I know that is a horse that's been beat to death. We know the signal to noise ratio. We know all that stuff about cassette tapes, but I want to explore it myself. And sometimes it's just fun to explore things yourself. So I want to get an oscillator set up an oscillator frequency generator and just kind of play pink noise and white noise and do the tone generator and sweep around on the audio tape and just kind of see what it can do and kind of talk about it like that and just explore it. So be on the lookout for that, I think, sometime soon. Other than that, I will wrap it up the most important way that I wrap every one of these podcasts up. You are worthy of love. You are worthy of giving love, and you are worthy of receiving love. And you are also worthy of your own self-respect. Embrace your geek thing, and I'll talk to you next time.